The sky belonged to the Allies now. It was January 2nd, 1945, and the smoke had finally cleared. Wing Commander Johnny Johnson stared across the Belgian airfield at the twisted wreckage of German fighters. Just 24 hours earlier, this had seemed impossible. "Jerry threw everything he had at us yesterday morning," he wrote to his wife. "We smashed him to pieces. I don't think we'll see the Luftwaffe again in any strength." He was right. But how did the once mighty German Air Force destroy itself so completely in a single day? Let's go back to where it all started. The morning mist hung heavy over Western Europe as January 1st, 1945 dawned. Allied pilots stumbled toward their coffee cups in mess halls across Belgium, Holland, and northern France. Many were nursing New Year's Eve hangovers. The war felt almost won. For months, the Luftwaffe had been little more than a memory, a ghost that rarely showed its face in these skies. Then, at exactly 9:20 a.m., the impossible happened. Hunter Karl Schnerer was climbing into his Messerschmitt Bf 109 cockpit. Through his radio headset came urgent German voices. Dozens of them. They were panicking, screaming coordinates, calling for help. In that moment, Schnerer realized something terrible. He was listening to his own Air Force dying. By sunset, the German Luftwaffe would lose nearly 300 fighters. Over 230 of Germany's most skilled pilots would be killed, captured, or wounded. Veterans who could never be replaced. This is the story of Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's final gamble and its most tragic defeat. But to understand this disaster, we need to travel back to when Hitler's eagles ruled the sky. In autumn 1939, the Luftwaffe was the world's most feared air force. Its pilots were battle-hardened veterans from the Spanish Civil War. Their aircraft represented cutting-edge technology. Sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s and thundering Junkers Ju-80D8s. When Germany unleashed blitzkrieg on Poland, the Luftwaffe cleared the skies. It paved the way for the Wehrmacht's lightning advance. For 2 years, German pilots dominated European airspace. They swept aside Poland's air force in days. They brought French aviation to its knees in weeks. During the Battle of Britain, they nearly destroyed the Royal Air Force. Hans-Joachim Marseille shot down 158 Allied aircraft before his death in 1942. Erich Hartmann would claim 352 victories, more than any pilot in history. These weren't just numbers. They were symbols of German air superiority that seemed unbreakable. But wars consume their own children. By early 1943, the tide was turning. American bombers appeared over German cities in growing numbers. They came protected by swarms of long-range fighters. The Luftwaffe found itself fighting a two-front air war. The math was cruel. For every German pilot shot down over enemy territory, he was gone forever, dead or captured. Meanwhile, Americans and British produced pilots by the thousands. Their training programs ran at full capacity in the safety of distant homelands. Adolf Galland commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. He watched this deadly arithmetic with growing horror. "We were bleeding to death in the sky," he later wrote. "Every day brought news of more losses we couldn't replace." By summer 1944, after D-Day, the situation was catastrophic. Allied fighters roamed German airspace almost at will. The Luftwaffe was reduced to hit-and-run tactics. It was in this desperate context that Hermann Göring conceived his final gamble. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last major Western offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. For a brief moment, German forces might actually break through Allied lines. But the offensive was failing. Allied air superiority made every daylight movement a nightmare. German generals pleaded for air cover. The Luftwaffe seemed powerless to provide it. Göring seized on this crisis as his opportunity. If he could eliminate Allied air power in one decisive blow, the ground offensive might succeed. More importantly, such a victory might restore his lost prestige with Hitler. The concept was simple in its audacity. The Luftwaffe would launch a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields. Catching enemy aircraft on the ground, German fighters would destroy hundreds of planes before they could take off. Göring named it Operation Bodenplatte, literally baseplate, though he preferred the more dramatic codename Hermann. It would be the largest air operation the Luftwaffe had mounted since the early war years. General Dietrich Peltz was tasked with planning the operation. He faced obstacles that would have stopped a less determined commander. Fuel supplies were critically low. Spare parts virtually didn't exist. Many pilots had never participated in large-scale operations. Most troubling, the institutional knowledge that made the early Luftwaffe formidable was gone. Veteran squadron leaders, experienced navigators, skilled mechanics. Most were dead, captured, or fighting elsewhere. In their place stood teenagers with brave hearts but limited skills. Yet somehow, Peltz began assembling his strike force. Over 1,000 aircraft would participate. They came from every fighter unit Germany could spare. Veterans pulled from homeland defense. Training units pressed into combat service. Even aircraft borrowed from flight schools. Every Messerschmitt Bf-109, every Focke-Wulf FW-190 that could fly would be thrown into this single gamble. The targets were carefully selected. Eindhoven Airfield in Holland, Brussels-Ever, and Brussels-Melsbroek in Belgium. Volkel, where Polish pilots flew deadly Spitfires. A string of Allied air bases that formed the backbone of enemy air power. Each target would be hit by a calculated force. Fighter bombers would strafe parked aircraft. Pure fighters would provide air cover. The attacks would be coordinated to prevent Allied reinforcement between bases. If everything went according to plan, the Allies would lose hundreds of aircraft in hours. But troubling complications emerged. The first problem was navigation. Many pilots had never flown long-distance formation missions. They would need to find targets in pre-dawn darkness, flying low to avoid radar detection, then coordinate complex attacks over unfamiliar territory. The second problem was even worse: friendly fire. The operation was so secret that German anti-aircraft units hadn't been informed. As Luftwaffe fighters streaked westward at low altitude, they would fly directly over German defensive positions. Flak crews would undoubtedly open fire on their own planes. Peltz raised these concerns but was told the element of surprise was more important. The massive fighter stream would accept casualties from their own defenses. As December 1944 ended, the pieces fell into place. Fuel trucks rumbled through the night to forward airfields. Ground crews worked frantically preparing aircraft. Many had been grounded for weeks due to maintenance issues. Pilots received final briefings. They studied aerial photographs of targets they would see only once, in combat. The weather would be crucial. The attack needed clear skies over targets, but cloud cover along the route. On December 31, 1944, that window appeared to be opening. New Year's Eve found Luftwaffe airfields bustling with unusual activity. Mechanics performed final checks on over 1,000 aircraft. Fuel trucks topped off tanks. Ammunition belts loaded into wing guns. The pilots themselves were a stark contrast to the confident veterans of 1940. Many were barely out of their teens. Their faces showed a mixture of excitement and terror. Lieutenant Fritz Kraft, a 19-year-old with fewer than 30 combat missions, wrote in his diary, "Tomorrow we strike a blow that will change the war." I pray I have the courage and skill to survive. Others were less optimistic. Squadron Commander Hermann Steger confided to his wingman, "I've seen too many decisive battles to believe this will end the war, but orders are orders." As midnight approached and 1945 began, the Luftwaffe's greatest gamble was hours from its moment of truth. At 8:00 a.m. on January 1st, 1945, engines roared to life across German airfields. The sound was magnificent and terrifying. A symphony of 1-200 Daimler-Benz and BMW engines spinning up to combat power. Wave after wave of German fighters lifted into the sky. The largest air armada the Luftwaffe had assembled in years. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s streamed westward in formation. Their camouflaged wings caught the first rays of rising sun. But even as this spectacle unfolded, disaster's seeds were already sown. The first casualties came within minutes of takeoff. Flying low to avoid radar, German formations crossed their own front lines. Nervous anti-aircraft crews opened fire immediately. The sight of low-flying aircraft triggered automatic response. Hans Müller, manning a 20mm flak gun near Aachen, later described the confusion. "We saw planes coming fast and low. In early morning light, all aircraft looked the same. We heard no warnings. What were we supposed to think?" Messerschmitt 109s began falling from the sky, shot down by German bullets. Pilots who had trained for months were destroyed by their own countrymen before they could engage the enemy. But formations pressed on. There was no turning back now. As the stream approached front lines, another problem became apparent. Many inexperienced pilots had difficulty maintaining formation. Aircraft began straggling, falling behind or veering off course. The careful timing Peltz had planned broke down. Some formations arrived early, others late. The coordinated attack became a series of piecemeal assaults. At approximately 9:20 a.m., the first German aircraft appeared over Allied airfields. What happened next would shock both sides and change the air war forever. The attack on Eindhoven began with seeming perfection. 36 Focke-Wulf 190s appeared out of the morning sun. They dove toward rows of parked Allied aircraft. Major Anton Haeckel, a veteran ace with 192 victories, led textbook-strafing runs. Fuel trucks blazed. Aircraft wings shredded under 20mm cannon fire. For the first minutes, everything went according to plan. Allied pilots stumbled from quarters to see German fighters racing across their airfield at 50 feet altitude. Explosions bloomed among parked Typhoons and Tempests, but the Allies recovered faster than Germans anticipated. Within minutes, surviving RAF pilots raced to their aircraft. Undamaged planes began taxiing frantically toward runways. This was the moment that would determine Operation Bodenplatz's fate. Everything depended on destroying enemy aircraft before they could take off. What happened next exposed the German plan's fundamental weakness. Many Luftwaffe pilots had never participated in ground attack missions. They were trained as fighter pilots, skilled at air-to-air combat, but unfamiliar with strafing techniques. Instead of methodical overlapping passes, they became fixated on individual targets, wasting precious ammunition and time. Worse still, inexperience led to poor target selection. Instead of focusing on aircraft, some attacked buildings or fuel storage. Meanwhile, Allied pilots who got airborne found themselves with an unexpected advantage. German attackers flew at extremely low altitude, focused on ground targets, largely unaware of threats from above. British and American fighters climbing away from attacked airfields found themselves perfectly positioned to attack raiders from behind and above. The battle was about to become a massacre, but not the one Germans had planned. The massacre began at 9:45 a.m. over Brussels airfield. Squadron Leader. Johnny Johnson was climbing away from chaos below when he spotted them. A formation of German Focke-Wulf 190s flying barely 100 feet above ground, completely absorbed in strafing runs. It was like shooting fish in a barrel, Johnson later recalled. These pilots were so focused on ground targets they'd forgotten to watch their backs. I got 3 before they knew I was there. This scene repeated across a dozen airfields simultaneously. The Luftwaffe's surprise attack was becoming a death trap for the attackers. At Volkel Airfield, Polish pilots of 308 Squadron scrambled with fury in their hearts. These men had watched their homeland crushed, had fought through the Battle of Britain, had survived years of exile. Now they had their chance for direct revenge. Flight Lieutenant Stanisław Skalski, Poland's leading ace, was airborne within 3 minutes. Below him, Messerschmitt 109s made strafing runs in neat, predictable patterns, exactly as they'd been taught in flight school. But school hadn't prepared them for an experienced combat pilot diving from above. Skalski's first burst caught a German fighter pulling out of its attack run. The 109 disintegrated in a fireball that scattered debris across the airfield. His second victim never saw him coming. "I felt no satisfaction," Skalski admitted years later. "These were children flying against veterans. Necessary, but not glorious." The pattern was identical everywhere. At Grimbergen, American P-47 Thunderbolts caught German raiders mid-attack. At Sint-Truiden, Royal Canadian Air Force Typhoons turned hunters into hunted. What began as Operation Bodenplatte had become a shooting gallery where inexperienced German pilots were systematically destroyed. But the full horror was only beginning to unfold. The Luftwaffe's problems went beyond simple tactical disadvantage. The fundamental assumptions underlying Bodenplatte had been catastrophically wrong. German intelligence estimated Allied airfields would be packed with aircraft on New Year's morning. In reality, many squadrons had moved to secondary airfields weeks earlier, dispersing aircraft to reduce vulnerability to exactly this type of attack. The neat rows of targets German pilots expected simply didn't exist at many locations. Even more devastating was the Luftwaffe's complete failure to account for Allied radar coverage. While formations flew low during approach, once attacks began, they became clearly visible on radar screens. Allied controllers could track every German formation. Vector interceptors to optimal positions. Coordinate responses across multiple airfields. Hauptmann Wilhelm Krinius led what started as 18 Messerschmitt 109s toward Volkel. Mechanical failures and navigation errors reduced his force to 12 before reaching the target. Within 5 minutes of beginning their attack, only 4 remained airborne. "The sky was full of Allied fighters," Krinius radioed desperately. "They seemed everywhere at once. Break off attack, every man for himself." But breaking off was easier said than done. Flying low over enemy territory, German pilots found themselves trapped between Allied fighters above and anti-aircraft guns below. The human cost mounted with terrifying speed. 20-year-old Klaus Weber was diving his Focke-Wulf 190 toward parked Allied aircraft when tracer rounds streamed past his cockpit. Behind him, a British Tempest closed rapidly. Weber pulled hard, trying to climb into a proper dogfight, but his engine had been damaged by ground fire. Black smoke poured from his cowling as his fighter lost power. Flight Lieutenant Pierre Klosterman closed for the kill with professional precision. Weber's 190 exploded in a massive fireball that lit the morning sky. Similar dramas played out across the battlespace. At Brussels-Melsbrook, American P-51 Mustangs intercepted German raiders forming up for their return journey. The air battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but claimed 15 German aircraft for 2 American losses. The mathematical reality was brutal. For every Allied aircraft destroyed on the ground, the Luftwaffe lost 3 or 4 fighters in the air. By 10:30 a.m., desperate radio calls flooded German command frequencies. Squadron leaders reported catastrophic losses. Pilots called for help that couldn't be provided. Formation commanders requested permission to abort missions that had already failed. Perhaps most tragic was that many losses were completely unnecessary. The attack on Maldegem airfield illustrated the deadly confusion plaguing Bodenplatte. 60 Messerschmitt 190s and Focke-Wulf 190s from 3 fighter groups converged on what intelligence identified as a major Allied base. They found an empty field. Unknown to German planners, Maldegem had been abandoned weeks earlier. The aircraft aerial reconnaissance spotted were derelicts, damaged planes left behind as worthless. Yet German pilots, following orders to the letter, pressed home attacks against meaningless targets. They strafed empty buildings and shot up abandoned aircraft, while Allied fighters vectored in from surrounding airfields. Major Georg Peter Eder, leading one German formation, realized the mistake immediately. But by then, it was too late. British and American fighters were diving out of the sun, and his pilots were trapped at low altitude with no room to maneuver. The slaughter was methodical and complete. Of 60 German aircraft attacking Maldegem, fewer than 20 made it back to German territory. 40 veteran pilots killed, wounded, or captured in exchange for destroying nothing of military value. This pattern of futile sacrifice repeated at multiple locations. German formations attacked auxiliary airfields, training bases, and administrative centers, while real Allied combat squadrons struck back from positions the Luftwaffe hadn't known existed. The return flight proved almost as deadly as the attacks. German pilots, many flying damaged aircraft and nursing wounds, had to navigate hundreds of miles of hostile territory while Allied fighters hunted relentlessly. Those who made it to German airspace faced one final bitter irony. The same anti-aircraft defenses that shot down German planes during departure now opened fire on survivors trying to return. Lieutenant Hans Dortmann, one of the few survivors from Sint-Truiden, nursed his shot-up Messerschmitt across the German border, only to be engaged by 80mm flak guns. His aircraft, already damaged and leaking fuel, took several more strikes before crash-landing miles from his home base. Dortmann survived with severe burns, but his experience epitomized Operation Bodenplatte's tragic waste. Skilled pilots were being destroyed not just by enemy action, but by their own side's confusion and desperation. As afternoon wore on and full scope of losses became apparent, stunned silence fell over Luftwaffe command centers. The numbers were almost impossible to believe. Of approximately 1,000 aircraft that took off that morning, fewer than 650 returned. Nearly 300 fighters destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The equivalent of an entire fighter wing wiped out in a single day. More devastating was the pilot casualty list. 237 airmen killed, wounded, or missing. An irreplaceable loss of experience and skill the Luftwaffe could never recover. Allied losses, by contrast, were minimal. Approximately 180 aircraft destroyed or damaged on the ground, but most were quickly replaced from massive American and British production lines. 31 Allied pilots killed or wounded, many ground personnel rather than aircrew. The exchange ratio Hermann Göring promised would favor Germany, 10-1, actually favored the Allies nearly 8-1. Beyond raw numbers lay an even more devastating truth. Operation Bodenplatte had consumed the Luftwaffe's last fighter reserves. The veteran pilots who died represented decades of accumulated combat experience. The destroyed aircraft had used fuel reserves that took months to accumulate. General Adolf Galland surveyed the wreckage with barely concealed fury. "We have just committed suicide," he told his staff officers. "In a single morning, we destroyed more of our own strength than the enemy managed in months of combat." Karl Schnerer, the young pilot who overheard panicked radio calls that morning, never made it to his assigned target. His Messerschmitt 109 was shot down by German anti-aircraft fire minutes after takeoff. Fritz Kraft, the 19-year-old who wrote so hopefully in his diary, was reported missing after the Eindhoven attack. His aircraft was never found. Local Belgian farmers discovered wreckage in a remote field after the war. He had died alone, far from home. Even survivors carried psychological scars that never healed. Hermann Steger returned to base with only 3 of his original 12 aircraft. The other 9 pilots under his command were dead, captured, or missing. He never flew combat again. The impact on German morale was immediate and profound. For years, the Luftwaffe had symbolized German technological superiority and fighting spirit. Now that pride was shattered. News of the disaster spread quickly despite official censorship. Soldiers on the Eastern Front learned their air force had ceased to exist. Submarine crews realized they would receive no air support. Anti-aircraft crews defending German cities understood they now stood alone against growing Allied bombing raids. Most tellingly, Hitler himself never again spoke of the Luftwaffe in public addresses. The Air Force that had once been the Third Reich's pride had become a source of embarrassment. The consequences extended far beyond German borders. The Battle of the Bulge, already failing, collapsed completely within days as Allied fighter-bombers resumed devastating attacks on German supply columns. More broadly, the operation marked the definitive end of German air power. From January 1945 onward, Allied aircraft operated over German territory with virtual impunity. Strategic bombing campaigns that previously faced determined fighter resistance now encountered only scattered opposition. Wing Commander Johnny Johnson captured the mood in a letter to his wife. "Jerry threw everything at us this morning, and we smashed him to pieces. I've never seen anything like it. The sky belongs to us now." As 1945 progressed, this prophecy became reality. German cities burned under round-the-clock bombing attacks with minimal fighter opposition. Allied armies advanced with complete air support. The Reich that promised to rule for 1,000 years found itself defenseless against enemies controlling the skies above its territory. The final irony was that Operation Bodenplatte had been conceived to restore German air power when it guaranteed the force's final destruction. By concentrating all resources into a single desperate gamble, the Luftwaffe ensured its failure would be complete and irreversible. Hermann Göring never publicly acknowledged his role in the catastrophe. At Nuremberg, he maintained Bodenplatte had been a tactical success, overwhelmed by superior Allied numbers. But private correspondence tells a different story, of a man haunted by destroying the air force he'd spent decades building. Surviving pilots carried the memory for the rest of their lives. In post-war interviews, many expressed pride in their courage and bitter regret over the operation's futility. They had been asked to sacrifice everything for a plan with no realistic chance of success. Adolf Galland, in his memoirs, perhaps best captured that New Year's morning tragedy. January 1st, 1945, was the day the Luftwaffe died. We sent our bravest young men to destruction, pursuing an impossible dream. They deserved better leadership than we gave them. Today, scattered across Belgium, Holland, and northern France, Small memorials mark spots where German fighters fell during Operation Bodenplatte. Some commemorate individual pilots. Others mark multiple crash locations. Local residents maintain these memorials with quiet dignity, honoring the courage of young men who died far from home in service of a cause history would judge harshly. These monuments remind us that individual bravery cannot overcome strategic incompetence and operational failure. German pilots displayed courage deserving recognition, even as we remember their cause was morally wrong and their mission strategically pointless. Operation Bodenplatte stands as military history's most complete disaster. A perfectly planned operation that achieved the exact opposite of its goals. It reminds us that good intentions and brave hearts aren't enough to overcome poor judgment and impossible odds. In the end, Bodenplatte accomplished what years of Allied air attacks had failed to achieve. It destroyed the Luftwaffe completely and permanently. The German pilots, who took off hoping to change the war's course, succeeded only in writing its final chapter. Their sacrifice marked not the beginning of German air power's resurrection, but the moment of its definitive death. The morning mist that shrouded Western Europe's airfields at dawn on January 4, 1945, lifted to reveal a fundamentally changed world. One where the skies belonged permanently to the Allied nations, where the German eagle would never again spread its wings in conquest.